So I want to give you guys a little backstory on these 5 tractors that I purchased last summer. And this series is going to focus on the Massey 393. And it's a shame that I didn't get some video of them at the time because there was some pretty cool footage that we could have had. And I wanted to set the stage by explaining the story behind how I came across these tractors and purchased them, managed to get them home, and what I've done to them so far, and how we plan on moving forward with this series on getting them back running and operational again. So my family owns some property about 10 miles from the town that we live in, and one day my dad and uncle were up there running this old International Dresser 175B track loader that they had recently bought, used for some property maintenance. And a neighbor lady stopped by and asked them if they were interested in buying her tractors. And this woman's husband had died several years back, and the tractors hadn't moved out of the barn since then. Well, Dad come home and he told me about it, and we decided to run up there the next day to check them out. I was kind of in the market for a project. So we talked to her there at her house, and she told us where they were at. We crawled across the fence, get an old cow lot, first batch of tractors. Inside the barn there were 3 Case 930s, one with the loader, one without, and one parts tractor parked off to the side that was half disassembled. All of them had 4,000 to 5,000 hours on the clock, and I wasn't really interested in 930 since we already have an Alice 185 with a big loader and a Massey 150 we use around the property. So we went over to the next barn to see what was in there and check out the smallest tractor she told us about. It was a Case or David Brown 995, 3,200 hours on the clock. It needed some front tires, a little rough around the edges, but it looked like it'd be a pretty handy tractor to have around since it's compact and it's got 60 horsepower diesel in it. And next to it, unknown to us, was this Massey 393 cab tractor, front wheel assist, bush hog, 2846 QT loader, and only 2,900 hours on the clock. So we looked all the tractors over, and of course, you know, they'd been setting for years and they were covered in dust. None of them had batteries, or if they did, they were shot. All the tires were flat on them, pretty much. And I mean, she told us that they'd all been driven into the barn and parked several years back when they'd finished up using them for the season before her husband had died, and they hadn't moved since, but you know, that's only so telling about the condition. We did check to see that there was pretty good fuel level in all of them, and they all had a good amount of coolant in them, so that was promising. So anyway, we went up and we talked to her for a little while, and I decided not to make an offer. I wanted to go do a little research first on them and think about it, and she didn't give the impression that she wanted to part with them. So we went up to the corner to get signal. I looked around on my phone a little bit, decided we'd go back, and I gave her an offer for all 5 of them. Well, she said that she wasn't interested in selling the Massey, and so I told her thanks for her time. We parted ways. Well, about a week later, she got back in touch with my dad, asked him if I was still interested in the tractors. I guess she talked it over with her daughters and decided that she better just sell all of them. So I was kind of on the fence about buying the whole lot since I was unsure of the condition, but I decided that I really only wanted the Massey and the 995, and the only way I was going to get them was to buy all of them. So I wrote her a check and purchased them. So we came back up the next day to start working on them. Fortunately, we owned some property from her just down the road, and I was planning on staging some of the tractors there until we could get them all the way back home. So we brought a generator up, an air compressor, and a bunch of tools and batteries, and decided to start working on the Massey since I wanted to get it running first. So I hopped into Massey and of course tried to start it, and the thing it'd been set for so long. It was completely covered in bird's nests. The headliner was falling down. It was packed full of bird's nests, mud daubers everywhere. The cab was just full of junk and old coats and pretty much you name it, old cans and electrical parts, and the dash was half tore apart. So I got up in there, turned the key on. We were getting at least some power from the battery that we had hooked up. I could see that there were a few lights coming on the dash. So We managed to crank it over for a while and sprayed some ether and just couldn't hardly get it primed up. Well, unknown to me was that there's a fuel primer on the right side of the engine. Well, this thing had been used in the hayfield and was leaking, of course, you know, like all these machines. And it was just completely covered in grease and dirt, and we couldn't hardly see what anything was on the side of the motor. I think one of the side covers was off of it or lifted up. So we cranked it, and finally managed to get it to fire off and primed up and had it running. Pulled it out, made sure the transmission worked, backed it back into the barn and called it a night, and figured we'd have to come back with a chainsaw because a big tree had fallen down. We were going to have to cut up and move out of the way to get the thing out of the lot and down the road. So we kept the 393 on our property for a couple weeks while we used it to pull start the 930s, at least the two that ran, get those moved, and then we used it to drag the parts 930 back to the property where we were keeping the others. And after that, I finally decided I was wanting to bring it back since we were no longer going to use it, so I could start working on it and getting it fixed back at home. So I rode up with my girlfriend one afternoon, and I hopped in it, and I had her follow me back on the country roads, and for the most part I didn't have any issues. Really the only problems that I had was that since it had been setting so long with half flat rear tires, there was kind of a flat spot in one of them, and it was causing it to bounce pretty bad when you got into third and fourth gear. And this guy, for some reason, he had the wrong size pins in 3 of the 4 spots on the bucket, and one of them was like a ½ inch undersized and wasn't even drilled for a snap ring. So they kept working their way out as this thing was shaking its way down the road, and I had to stop periodically and knock the pin back in with the hammer, but we managed to make it back to the house without any issues. So after getting the tractor back home, a few days later, I decided to start by investigating the electrical issues. I managed to track down a service manual for the Massey 300 series. It covered like 12 different models. And I located the serial number on the back of the tractor and was able to determine that mine was produced in 1993. So the only light at the time that I recall to be working on the dash was the alternator charge warning light. And I'd previously checked and with the multimeter and knew there was no power getting to the batteries from the alternator. Now, I went through the service manual and performed a few of the tests listed to determine that the alternator itself was bad, and likely also the reason why my tachometer was not functioning. Instead of a mechanical tach cable on these, the tach processes the AC frequency coming off the alternator signal wire. So I ordered a 70 amp replacement, got it installed without any issues, and sure enough, the alternator warning light went off and the tach started working. After that, I decided to start cleaning out the cab and working on the other electrical issues. As I mentioned before, the cab on this thing was horrible. You know, too many years of sitting vacant in that barn without the doors on. I don't know how many hours I spent pulling out straw and knocking off mud dauber nests. I finally decided I was going to have to take the headliner all the way off if I was ever going to get it all out of there. And I'm glad I did, because I mean, it was just completely packed full, and I would have never gotten it all using the shop vac. So I've got a picture here. You can see a big portion of all the dirt, old rags, random bolts, parts, all that I pulled out of the cab while cleaning this thing out. So since the headliner was moved and the cab was cleaned out, I could access the wiring for the front and rear cab work lights. And at the time, only one of the rear work lights were working, and I wanted to get those all fixed up. So I started by checking the circuit integrity to each of the lights, and from there I was able to determine that the issue was just because, sure enough, 3 of the 4 halogen bulbs were burned out. So I installed replacements, got the light housings adjusted, and decided to move on to the rest of the mess. So like I mentioned earlier, the dash on this thing was already half apart. There were jumper wires, wrong fuses, unhooked wires, just a mess all around. I started tearing into the dash. Some of the plastic mounting tabs already broken off. One of the climate control levers was locked up. A fuel cutoff switch wouldn't move in or out. The heater blower motor worked, but was loaded up with mud daubers. I found out pretty quick that the AC compressor was locked up after I figured out which fuse the circuit used. I threw in a fuse loop, hook up an amp clamp to it, and saw that it was drawing 35 amps when the switch was flipped on, but the motor wasn't blowing. So as of now, I've decided to just pull the AC fuse and go without it, since I'm going to have the doors off this thing most of the time anyway. I managed to figure out what size fuses were supposed to go in each of the 12 slots. Got those straightened out. I pulled the gauge cluster out, started to check all the traces to see if there could have been any issues in those that were causing the various warning lights not to work. There was a few blown bulbs, incandescent bulbs, but the circuitry was all good. So I ended up replacing all the bulbs with LEDs so I could see them better. When it was bright outside, you pretty much couldn't see when any of those lights were on anyway. So with that checked out, I wanted to get the headlights and flashers working. I started looking into the dip switches. This 393's got 6 light switches. 2 for the front and rear work lights, which are mounted up in the headliner. I have those working fine. And then there's 4 in the dash. One's a single pole switch for the headlight high beams. Next to it's a dual pole switch for the dash lights and the low headlight beams. There's a single pole switch next to it for the hazards and flasher lights. And then next to, on the other side of the console, is a dual pole switch for the direction indicators, turn signals essentially. So the only working switch out of the 4 was the dash backlight low beam switch. I checked the headlights first. The plastic housing was cracked, but the bulbs were fine inside, and I was able to bypass the switch by hooking the lights circuitry directly up to battery power and proved that the circuitry was solid outside of the switches. I went plastic welded the cracked housing, reassembled the whole thing, shot it with some black paint, put it back together. So the issue with the high beams actually turned out to be poor contact in one of the headlight switches. The high beam switch is actually electrically connected to the low beam switch, in that it can't be turned on until low beams are already on. So I managed to work in some silicone spray and get the high beams working. And it was actually a similar issue with the hazard lights. Although most of the flasher bulbs were busted up, one of the rears was actually still good. And so I used it to rule out that the flashing relay was not faulty. And I determined that the issue was caused by the direction indicator, since those two, the hazards and the direction indicator, are electrically connected. So if the direction indicator is flipped on the left or right, it overrides the hazards so it indicate a turn direction. Well, since this direction indicator was seized up in the right turn position, it wasn't allowing the flashers to work. And I searched online for replacement, couldn't come up with anything in the US, and everything overseas was too unreasonable on shipping. So I did manage to find a diagram of the internals of the switch. I tried disassembling the switch. Even then, I still couldn't get it to work correctly. It ended up breaking it in the process of disassembling it all the way down. So I finally decided the easiest solution was just going to be to run jumper wires into the switch connector itself. This would keep the switch in the off position, which allows the flasher unit to work properly and not be overridden. So at this point now, I have properly working alternator, tack, work lights, headlights, hazard lights. So I wanted to figure out what was going on with the mystery wiring around the engine. So looking this thing over, I noticed there were at least 3 unhooked wires around the motor. I figured out one. It was pretty easy. On the left side of the engine, it went to the oil pressure switch, and I was able to get some continuity on the pressure switch to ground. However, when I hooked up a 2 amp test light that I made straight from battery power, it couldn't support that load. So I was able to determine that the switch itself was bad. I ordered and got a replacement installed, no problems. So another wire that was really started to throw me for a loop was unhooked, and based on its color was supposed to go to the starter solenoid. I looked and looked and couldn't find any open position on the solenoid, and finally realized that apparently either the neutral safety start switch or the PTO safety switch were bad, and the previous owner had just bypassed the safety circuit altogether and went straight from the starter solenoid to the starter switch. So I studied the wiring diagram some more and realized that he had the starter solenoid wire going to the wrong terminal on the starter switch on top of bypassing the safety switch. So it was hooked up where what Massey calls the thermostat wire, where it should have gone. So after scratching my head some more, I realized that what Massey calls the thermostat isn't actually related to the cooling system. What it is that when the key's turned halfway to the right position, current flows through resistive coil in the intake manifold. A small amount of fuel is injected. It heats up the intake charge, apparently to help with cold starts. So after getting that fiasco lined out, at this point it's like mid-November, and I decided I better get the dash reassembled and move the tractor into storage for the winter. So during this time frame, the only other things that I did to it were I fixed up the mangled steps on the left side of the tractor. I unbolted those, and I managed to weld up some new ones that actually turned out pretty nice. The exhaust was beat up pretty bad. Apparently he got it hung up in some trees. I ended up cutting it off and installed a flapper on it to keep the rain out. I did some work on the front end loader. I got those incorrect size bucket pins replaced and started working on the grease zerks. A couple of the zerks were missing altogether for some reason, and most of the rest were seized up. So I ended up going through, and I'm pretty sure I replaced every single zerk on the front end loader. So I think that pretty much covers everything up to where we are now. And now that it's warming up again, I'm going to get the 393 back out, continue fixing it up. There's plenty more to do. I plan on changing all the fluids and filters. I'm going to take the front end loader off because it actually has to come off to replace the air filter. I'm going to reinstall the headliner, try to figure out what's going on with the differential lock circuit. I don't think that the differential lock works on it. I want to get that figured out. There's some hydraulic leaks that I've got to fix. I'm going to replace some or all the battery cables since the insulation's dry rotted on some of them. I'm afraid there could be issues with the positive wires shorting the ground. I think those are all the things I can think of off the top of my head anyway right now. I think this is going to be a pretty interesting series as I continue to fix up the tractor, and we're also going to be putting it to work as that's going on. So I've got several other projects in the works that I'm filming, so stay tuned for more, and thanks for watching.